Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Building Supply Chain Resilience. You can probably see Dave from Fictiv and Misha from Macrofab in the corner of your screen. There you go. I'll introduce them in a little bit more detail in a second. Just before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping things. We will be recording the webinar, so you'll have the opportunity to see the recording later, so no need to vigorously take notes. And also we'd like to be as conversational as possible, so please go ahead and type any questions into the Q&A box or into the chat window as you go. So let's get started with some short introductions. Our two guests today are Dave Evans, who's the co-founder and CEO of Fictiv. Dave was a Forbes 30 under 30 last year, or maybe the year before. Still under 30, Dave?
Not still under 30. I have too many gray hairs that show for that now.
Well, that's going to happen, especially in the last couple of months. And prior to that, Dave was with Ford. Misha Govstein is the CEO of Macrofab. Prior to Macrofab, Misha was a co-founder of Alert Logic, a company that he built to sales of $120 million. Misha, Dave, welcome.
Thanks for having us, Bill. Super
excited. I'm still under 43, so.
Yeah, well, there you go. You're going to be one of the 40 under, no, 43 under 43. We'll have to start a new category for that. I'm hoping they'll do a 60 under 60 at some point, but who knows? Anybody that doesn't know me, my name is Philip Stoughton. I write for Forbes and a number of other industry journals, and run a communications company called Scoop. So let's get into what we're going to be talking about today. What I want to explore today is how we get to this idea of what supply chains need to be and where we've been so far. So we'll talk a little bit about the perfect storm of disruptions that we've had since the beginning of this year, and we'll explore a little bit through some examples of how companies have been responding, and particularly how Macrofab and Fictiv's customers have been responding. And then we'll get into exploring the supply chain of the future, obviously with a bias towards those digitally enabled supply chains that we think are so important, and explore some of the key ingredients of those in terms of resilience and what's needed for that supply chain going forward. We'll then get into a bit of a Q&A session. We've already had some questions in from registrants as they've put their names down for the webinar, but I'm sure we'll get some more as we go through the debate here today. As I say, please continue to put those in, and we'll get to as many as we can. Any we don't get to, we'll certainly follow up with email or some communication afterwards. So really what I wanted to explore a little bit is this idea of a perfect storm of disruption, and it has been a disruption that's occurred on multiple levels. It's not the first disruption we've ever had, and it's certainly not going to be the last, but it feels like it's the biggest, certainly in terms of impact. So if we kind of look at a timeline, there were already challenges to the supply chain throughout last year and maybe even into 2018 as a result of the trade war between the US and China and tariffs and the impact of that. And that was making a lot of people rethink what they were doing. And I think there were already some changes occurring. And then we get to 2020, and we always start the year in January. And I remember having conversations with both Dave and Misha about this, about preparation for Chinese New Year, making sure we're ready. We have that predictable disruption, those expectations of what we need to do in terms of planning and stocking and what we need to do to get ready for the ramp. And then we started to see the news of COVID-19 in Wuhan, extend into factory closures, and we saw the impact there. And then we kind of moved from the territory of predictable supply chain disruption to very unpredictable supply chain disruption. And at the time, I think everybody thought it was quite an isolated problem in China, and it very quickly moved from from there to Europe and then on to the US and pretty much everywhere in the world now. So we've seen that disruption throughout that period to supply chain. The other impact that we've seen as that's gone through is this disruption to demand, partly due to the economic slowdown, but then secondly due to a disruption in actual demand as a result of what people need and what we need to manufacture. So we have the potential downturn because of the economic effect, and then we have the requirement for specific products as people are looking for PPE and as they're looking for ventilators, that kind of equipment. And we'll talk a little bit about that because I think it's interesting how that happened. The Defense Production Act was evoked in the US initially to compel companies to make certain products. So again, impact on demand there. The third element that we had in terms of the triple play of those disruptions was the disruption to workplaces. So, you know, some factory closures, some factories were closed for a short term and then deemed essential and reopened. Then obviously, you know, the social distancing and the challenges that created. And at the same time, we were seeing China starting to return to work and open more and more capacity. And we're still seeing those disruptions now. So the next phases, as I see them, you know, we're in this kind of urgent phase, then we're going to the kind of important phase of what are we doing through the recovery, and then that really essential phase of what the new norm looks like as we go into the future. So after any storm, there's a trail of disruption, and I think after this particular storm, I think everybody feels that the world will never be the same. So the outcome that we have in the short term is high unemployment, which creates a challenge in itself, and that's true everywhere in the world. But Europe, US, certainly where I am here in Australia, we're at 10% unemployment, which we haven't been at for like 50 years. Increased fear and nationalism, I think, is starting to occur in various different places. We're seeing a bit of an anti-China sentiment in terms of supply chain, you know, a fear of having too much dependence on China as our supply chain. And I think that's sparking a debate around globalization. Should we be globalized, or how globalized should we be? So I think that's having its own impact. So then what I wanted to do with the guys here, and we'll do this as we go through our hour here today, is think about what the desired supply chain is and what that needs to be, because I think it's way more complex than, you know, globalized, nationalized, those kind of things. So thinking about the factors that we need in the supply chain of the future. Clearly agility is one of them, but resilience is way higher on the agenda than it has been in the past. And you know, we think of things like just in time, and I think people are thinking more about just in case now than they are about just in time. Adaptability has become important, so people have had to pivot their production, so they need a supply chain that's more adaptable. They need more choice. And again, regardless of where you sit on the globalization debate, it's going to be about having the choice to place products where you want. And I think there's an increasing view that those supply chains need to be able to react really fast. So digital is the approach to do that. So what I wanted to explore first of all, and perhaps I can start with you, Misha, is just what you've seen over that last couple of months, what challenges you've had from your customers, and kind of how that's developed and how you've been able to help there.
Yeah, we've seen companies, obviously for some companies, the disruption was in a form of slowing down. For others, it was all about accelerating. And that's actually where I think we saw a lot of our approach and our technology really shine. We had a number of people that needed to design a product quickly, and not just design it, but take it to production. Their normal suppliers were, in some cases, very much frozen because either their supply chain was broken or their factory was inaccessible. Because we deal with networks, right? We have a factory network where we have more than 50 factories where we can deploy their jobs into any one of them, we were able to very quickly get them through a design phase and launch them into production faster than they would have otherwise. We've seen anything from ventilators get accelerated in their design cycles to things you just don't think about, right? We had a longtime customer that builds LED lighting systems, and you would wonder, why does that have to do with COVID? Well, if you remember, right, there were a lot of temporary hospitals built. So what do you need for those hospitals? Everything, right? You need lights, you need, you need IoT devices, you need nursing stations set up. All of it is electronics, which is what we specialize at Macrofab. So we had some customers that needed to spin down production because their demand got slower, and we had some other customers that needed to go faster, and our network was able to absorb it. And then, probably a month into it, all of a sudden there was a wave of customers saying, hey, I just added coronavirus specific feature sets to my products. So all of a sudden we started to see a wave of IoT enabled social distancing devices. And they went from, trying to figure out what they're going to do to saying, hey, can I get a year's worth of production in the next 2 months? And the answer is yes.
Yeah. Hey, Misha, I got an advert come through on email for a social media product, and it was basically a lamp around about this size that you put on your chest with a siren, and when someone comes within 1.5 meters of you, it goes off. That is, I don't know who that's meant to scare me or them, but it's a I don't know, supply and demand, I guess. Dave, what have you been seeing? Because it's kind of worked its way around the globe, hasn't it, over the last 2 to 3 months?
Yeah, for sure. And I love this conversation because we can cover both the electronics on the Macrofab and Misha's side, and we deal on the mechanicals at Fictiv specifically. And so for us, what we knew, we're a global team, so we have folks both in Asia as well as the United States. And so in January, we knew that China was going to see a longer ramp coming out of Chinese New Year than what we'd seen historically. Obviously, we had no idea of the scale that would hit in January as we were predicting. And so we set up to bring up additional supply in both Mumbai, India, as well as in Taipei and Taiwan. And so as China shut down in late January, February, and early March, we actually moved almost 15% of production out of China to the different regions, both in Mumbai and Taipei, as well as coming back domestically to the United States. And then as the United States got hit kind of mid-March through to today, we actually saw a lot of the work move from the US and push back over to Asia as facilities came back open. And so this concept of, I think, true agility of being able to move the location of manufacturing around. This was like a case study in real life. It literally felt like we were sitting inside of a Harvard Business Review, case study example of how do you build agile supply chains. And so I think similar to what Misha said, there's been industries which have slowed down completely, some consumer electronics, automotive for sure, but there's been others that have truly picked up in a lot of ways. Say in the medical space, or people converting existing solutions to meet a PPE or some type of medical device. So I think that there's been a lot of examples of just kind of this concept I'm sure we'll talk about, but just-in-time manufacturing, that people are saying, I need to accelerate my development schedules or get to market faster. And so we've it's been great to be able to use our business model as an example for how to put this type of agility in there, and excited to talk on this topic today.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned there about just in time is really interesting, and I think we'll get to that a little bit later, but I wanted to talk about that whole inventory discussion, because I think that's playing on a lot of people's minds at the moment. So Misha, maybe you can talk a little bit about to these slides with respect to what the data's been saying for some time out there in the marketplace.
Yeah, and we have a unique perspective on this because Macrofab has a network of factories in North America, and people would actually be surprised how many electronics factories there are in North America and how much electronics production that's done here. But one of the things we watch year over year is just how much are we seeing in terms of imports from China into United States, and this is manufacturing as a whole. So this isn't just electronics, and this is actually the first time in I think 11 years that we've seen a decline in imports from China. And this is something I think people don't fully grasp, is that unless you're in a supply chain front lines, you don't realize that the supply chain has actually been disrupted for the last couple of years. So, we watch these headlines about trade wars, but at the end of the day, you can still go to a store, you can still buy a toaster, you can still do whatever you need to. You don't really know what impact it's having. Well, it's actually been having a pretty disruptive impact already. Supply chains don't move overnight unless there are digital platforms like for Fictiv and Macrofab. So we've actually seen that shift happen over the last year or so. This happened before 2020. 2020 kind of compressed that rate of change into a couple of months, started shifting even more. But we've seen, manufacturing start to leave China because of the trade war and go into Vietnam and Mexico. Those have been the two biggest beneficiaries. So I think we've actually seen the rebalancing already. And, honestly, to me, the coronavirus disruption doesn't mean anything more than just expect more supply chains to rebalance and rebalance faster. None of these are isolated events, right? This whole model where we've been, at a stable state for the last 20 years, where we keep putting more and more into Asia, and we keep kind of doing business with one or two factories, and that's how things work, and that stability is there. That ship has sailed. I would assume that, I'm not going to predict what the next wave of disruption is going to be. And if you were to ask me last year, do you think a pandemic is going to disrupt it next? I would have thought you were crazy, but I would expect the unexpected. This is just, the last year was the first couple of steps, and things are going to accelerate going forward.
Yeah, it's a question of being ready, isn't it? Regardless of what that unpredictability, where that unpredictability comes from. Right. Do you think, and Dave, I'm curious with your view on this, do you think the change there from 18 to 19 is all about trade wars and tariffs, or do you think there was a desire to correct an imbalance prior to that, and it wasn't just driven by politics?
I think what's important is that you're always going to have a policy and government layer on top of any of this conversation as we talk about supply chain. And so as you look at this, like imagine even if we went to a 10-year low on this, so you went from 13% down to 9% in 2008. Even at that, you're still importing 9 to 10%, of total manufactured goods. So I think the fact remains that even if we see more reshoring, and let's say that moves a basis point or two, you're still going to have dependency on other countries for importing goods, regardless. And so I'm sure for a lot of the attendees that are listening to this, maybe your final assembly is done domestically. Maybe you've made the choice to reshore that, but you still have tier 2 and tier 3 supply that is offshore. You're still going to have some amount of components that are going to be made non-locally, and that's just the fact of globalization. And so really what I would push, and what I love about looking at the MRI, so what Misha's shown here is that you really need to think about geographic resilience. So where is my full product made end to end? And that's going all the way down to your raw goods. And we'll talk about this, but you need to look at shipping and logistics. You need to look at import, export. You need to look at component sourcing all the way to final goods. And that's where the complexity of supply chain really goes. And I think it really comes down to that we'll talk about is agility and digitization. If you have to manage this entire suite and you have to do it through spreadsheets and people, it doesn't take a pandemic to disrupt that. Really, it takes just a small wave for sure.
Yeah, and I think what's really important there is you do have to go down through a lot of layers, through a lot of tiers. It's not just where you're signing the purchase order. Yeah, there's more to it. Again, this one, Misha, I'll let you speak to this one for a moment.
Yeah, I think one of the, and I think this is consistent with everything Dave was saying. I would encourage people to start thinking about how they're managing their supply chain as a portfolio as opposed to a single decision. And like Dave said, you shouldn't assume that you can just reshore. And this, this actually has nothing to do with nationalism, right? Maybe the right place for you to assemble, you do final assembly isn't US because your product is complex or it's changing rapidly.
Yep.
I guarantee you it's going to be virtually impossible to source all of those components from the United States, nor is it a good idea, nor should you, nor can you, right? You should assume that your supply chain for tier 2 and tier 3 components is going to be distributed. Even if it's not, raw materials will come from all over the world. So assume that you're going to have to build a supply chain that that is designed for that. What I think is more relevant is that you got to think about it as something that can change at any given moment, and you have a lot of optionality in your portfolio for responding if there's some kind of disruption. And I think this is where when I talk to a lot of companies that think they have it nailed on their supply chain today, that's probably the biggest blind spot, is that it assumes the normal course of things, and I wouldn't expect that going forward, right? We haven't had a war in a long time. We haven't had the type of political instability we've seen for the last 5 years in a long time. I think we need to prepare supply chains to absorb any sort of risk, and that requires digitizing and being smarter about how you make those decisions. What do I advise people against doing? Making their supply chain decisions based on just RFQs that blast out there and choose lowest cost suppliers. That's probably not the best way to arrange your supply chain. Not that cost doesn't matter. I think cost always matters, but I think there's going to be a lot more factors that go into your decision making than just whether you can find the lowest bidder, right?
Yeah, I think I'll echo what Misha's saying, that I think we'll see a shift across this kind of cost, performance, and risk of what the priority of a company is. And so it's not that cost gets eliminated from the equation, but you might see folks that want to build a higher performing supply chain, or where they're actually calculating what is my downside risk, and they're using those calculations to dictate supplier selection or strategic sourcing or final assembly. And so it's more for folks that are watching here. Make sure you're looking at your supply chains and not just thinking about a PPV metric, that you're actually looking at different strategic initiatives inside of the organization to say, what's going to dictate my supply chain? How am I going to make strategic decisions? Don't let it just be purchase price variance.
Yeah, and I think what's key there is also understanding what we mean by cost. So not getting costs confused with price.
Yep.
If you just look at the single price for a unit and don't consider every other element that goes into actually the total cost of ownership of that product, and some of the hidden costs and some of the costs of risk, then you're in dangerous territory of not understanding your supply chain. And I think part of this whole digital process is actually having visibility and data. So we kind of reach this idea of a supply chain of the future that's digital, that is accessible to everybody, that's resilient, agile, adaptable, sustainable, all those words. What do you see as those key factors? Are we hitting those? Are they the right factors, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I think that for supply chain in general, the warts have never been more exposed than they are today. And you open this conversation up, Phil, I think, talking about just the most recent history of, talking about trade wars, and then, this very short thing, which Misha said, that we've had a decade happen in a matter of a couple months in terms of seeing all the warts in Q1 of 2020. And so as a result, for our side, and I think Misha would agree, we're a technology company. And so we compare ourselves to the Facebooks and Googles of the world, more so than like, what is Jabil doing, or how is Flextronics doing this? And so if you look in the software world, that's where all the fun's happening, that they have agility, that it's accessible, that, data centers are resilient to power outages and earthquakes and all of these things. But if you look at supply chain and manufacturing, we are so at risk of any type of force majeure situation, any type of political tension, any type of other industries that go down. Airlines stop traveling, belly cargo is not available, all of a sudden a different industry gets hit. So I think as we look at the future of supply chains, we have to think, how do you digitize this? How does this start to look more like AWS, more like cloud computing software, and less like spreadsheets, emails, and relying on people to get on planes to solve issues? And so I think we have to build arguments for that and help companies see how they start building the supply chain of the future.
Yeah, and I think.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Phil.
No, I was just going to say that whole getting on flights thing's become an issue because, you know, apart from having a supply chain that's disrupted, it's a supply chain that people can't just fly out to China and fix. So, sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say, Misha?
You know, I think some of this is just a challenge of which level of abstraction we're dealing with and even which language we use, right? I think one of the concepts that's been beaten up over the years, and I will come out and admit that I just don't understand it. I think Industry 4.0, I have no idea what that is. I don't know what exactly it's going to do. And I think that, you know, to some degree, agile, you know, accessible, sustainable, these are terms that can also potentially pave over some of the practicalities of what we're trying to do. You know, Dave mentioned the cloud, and I actually think that's the right level of abstraction, but I think it's hard for a lot of people in the hardware world to really fully buy into what that means. I visited a customer at one point, and they, you know, presented their company vision to us. It was given to them by their CEO, and he challenged their supply chain team to be more DevOps oriented. And I said, hey, I can help you with that. I think I know a lot about DevOps. And they said, you know, I don't even know what that means. You know, like what does a DevOps enabled supply chain mean exactly, right? Let's get really practical, right? You know, Zoom has been a phenomenal story. I think their demand shot up 20 times, right? In a very short amount of time. And yet what you have not heard are stories about how Zoom failed, fell apart, had an outage. I mean, just go back to 10 years from, earlier, right? Twitter couldn't keep the lights on. You know, they had databases that were falling over, fail whaling all over the place. That's kind of where supply chain world is right now, right?
Misha, could you imagine if you owned an SMT line? Like if you own the machines and your demand went up 20x in a month?
Well, Dave, I actually do own one, right? So we have one SMT line,
yeah.
And then we have hundreds of them that are available to us through our network. And that's
a
conscious choice because I know that, you know, there's just single points of failure and they just don't work in the manufacturing world. But you know, the ironic thing is that what AWS really ushered in is the notion that you're going to build for failure. You're going to, you know, forget about, you know, like holding people accountable for why their code breaks. Build it assuming the code will break, right? Build for components that are designed to scale out linearly. Assume that all of it's going to break down and build your infrastructure in a way that allows you to scale out. So trivial software, we're talking about social media, is built on much more resilient concepts now than manufacturing. And that's the change that we have to really see. We got to start thinking about these things as cloud environments that allow us to decouple ourselves from physical infrastructure. And that, look, to me, when we talk about agility in Industry 4.0, the real practical matter is, you know, go through a war planning scenario, do a tabletop and say, what happens when I take a factory out of commission? How long are we down for? That should be the kind of thing you're surviving for. And that's really what this whole vision is about, right? If you're trying to get to a truly agile supply chain, what it means is that it's digitized and it means it can absorb any sort of disruption out there. So if you scenario play and you say,
absolutely.
You know, somebody vaporized our supply chain. What happens next, right? How long does it take to get back to business? Those are the scenarios we should be planning for.
Yeah. I want to come back to that point that you mentioned about capacity, Dave, because I think we need to cover elasticity in the capacity side of things. But just let's try and get through some of these slides. Misha, this is again another one of yours. Can you just talk us through this?
And
modeling?
100% related to what I was just speaking about, right? If your supply chain is rigid and designed for single point of failures, then your ability to pivot and be able to adapt to new conditions in the ground is pretty limited, right? The most essential tool you have in your disposal now is digitization, right? If you digitize your unit of work, right? What I'm going to put in a factory. And I think both Fictiv and Macrofab actually do this, right? Dave told me a story about how they were able to move, their supply, from China to India in just a couple of days. The only reason that's possible is because it's digitized, right? We had somebody ask us the practical nature of like pivoting, asking OEMs like Ford and GM and Tesla being able to utilize their existing manufacturing infrastructure to produce medical devices and equipment. That's a great question, right? You can do that if your production is digitized. You can't do that if it's working through paper and emails and PDFs. One of the weirdest thing I read about was that Ford was able to ramp up production very quickly, but they had to 3D scan 7,000 mechanical parts in order to even go to production. What does that mean? It means that none of that was digitized to begin with. So what do you get when you start working with digital platforms? From day one, your job is digitized, and that's really what lets you be truly agile, right?
Yeah. And Misha, again, this is one of yours. Profitability, there's got to be a financial benefit.
Yeah, I think everything we're talking about comes down to, why should you do this in the first place? You shouldn't do this because we had a pandemic, right? I don't know if we're gonna have a pandemic in the future or not. It doesn't matter. In fact, what really matters is, are you able to continue to deliver product? Are you in business while your competitors are out of business? Can you redesign your product and relaunch it in a couple of days if you need to? And digitization lets you get there. So the reason for that is profitability. There's been studies done on this, and on average, people that are moving to digital manufacturing models at multiple levels are more profitable. So, this thing is going to be behind us at some point, and I wouldn't think about getting ready for the next pandemic. I would be thinking about how to make sure that I outrun my competition and deliver a more profitable operating model.
And I'll pause here because I know we had one question that came in that is talking about how do I build a case for management to be more digital? If I wanted to recommend to my boss that we go this direction, what should I do to resonate the most? I just want to pause on this slide that one of the best arguments that you can make is one that is, profit or economic based. Yeah. And so I think the research that's really strong that's done here is, if you see in that second column, the digital laggards versus digital leaders, you can see just the difference, the delta between the two of gross margins, earnings, incomes, that really it's saying that digital companies make higher margins, better earnings, better income, and it's really at a fractional of an IT spend, that you're not seeing much of a delta there. And so we'll get into this strategy a little bit, because two topics that come up in digital a lot are both how do I make the argument to my boss, and then the second one is around quality. And so I want to make sure that we hit on these topics throughout the discussion today. But I love this slide, Misha. I think it's a really clear argument for how you. And
I think tariffs are probably one of the best examples, right? Overnight, all of a sudden, your cost basis went up. So if you were on a digital platform that could reroute you to tariff-free zones or places where tariffs were had less of an impact, you all of a sudden paid less for materials than everybody else. That's practically how digital technology gets you out of harm's way quickly when you got to go retool, right?
Yeah. So let's explore a little bit about, let's just briefly, so everybody understands where both Fictiv and Macrofab exist. Let's explore what this digital manufacturing platform actually looks like, and kind of how it works in the various parts of the team. Dave, perhaps you can just give me that kind of 2-minute, how does a digital platform work?
Yeah, great. So let's step back a little bit. What's the solution set that we're talking about here? This concept of a digital platform is really around enabling choice and flexibility. And so the idea is, if you work with just a local manufacturer that owns machines, you don't have much choice. You're always going to go to them. Even if it's not the right part or the right product, it's a relationship that you know. And so the concept of building a digital platform is to increase choice for any product development company. And this could be in medical, aerospace, consumer, or whatever. The second is flexibility. So if I have all this choice that I can build in many locations, how do I have flexibility for where I produce, no matter if it's a tariff, if it's a pandemic, it's a tsunami that hits, any of these types of situation. And the benefits that we see a lot of is that you get reduced overhead costs. So it's really around removing people from the equation so that a single person can do more work, because you don't have to scan 7,000 parts like Misha's saying. You can just have all the digital information at your hands. You have this concept of basically virtually unlimited capacity. We compared this to, the Amazon or the AWS model, where cloud computing essentially is unlimited capacity. Yes, there's a finite to it, but when you compare on-prem server racks to the cloud computing power that you have through an Azure and AWS, you're really able to have a much higher amount of capacity. I think it's important that the vetting of suppliers is really critical here, and we'll get into that in a little bit to really control quality. And then the second one is it's all around on-demand manufacturing, that a digital platform should allow you to have much lower MOQs, minimum order quantities, but also this ability to have supply when you need it. Not what are you planning for, but like truly when you need it. So this is a great example that we can get into for how Fictiv solves this, as well as Macrofab.
Yeah, and Misha, again, I think this is a good point to bring back up that idea of elastic capacity. It is really about having, we talk about on-demand manufacturing, but it's capacity on demand, isn't it? It's that idea that you can ramp by 20x and then you can, you can shift very, very quickly.
Yeah. Well, I think it's capacity, but it's also tapping into the right resources. I think Fictiv has several thousand factories and shops that can tap into. With electronics, usually you produce a higher volume, and we have 50 factories in our network, but the capacity there is immense. But what's even more important is what is just the right factory, what is just the right machine shop, for example, for that particular job. And this is where I think supply and demand is matched very suboptimally right now, and is matched up much more optimally through platforms like Fictiv and Macrofab. And by the way, going back to the question we had about Tesla and Ford and other manufacturers producing medical devices, by the way, just to be very clear, I thought that was a lot of really phenomenal work and really impressive. Look, I'll be a little cheesy. Made me proud to be an American to watch him do all that stuff, but at the same time, watching auto factories try to produce medical devices is pretty strange. We have a lot of factories that, I was fascinated that, Flex wasn't involved, Jabil wasn't involved. They produce medical devices every single day, right? So that's an example of where, we should be using digital technologies to automatically figure out which factory is the right place for scaling up that production and how much it can scale. We have small customers, we're building in 6 factories in parallel because their lead times demand it, right? So it's all about tapping into just the right resources, getting a much better outcome than you could before. That video from Tesla where they built a ventilator, it was a pretty fascinating, design, but it didn't seem like something you could put into a hospital, for example, right? So not just about being able to do it, it's also about getting the job done right. And, how do we get you into the, get you to the best factories out there you might have never even heard of, because nobody knows about these factories. We have factories in Mexico, for example, that are beautiful and they're designed for scale, and small companies can't get into them unless they work through a platform like ours. That's really what digital technology should let you tap into.
Yeah, and I think what you talked about with respect to automotive companies trying to make ventilators and companies trying to pivot was actually a great example. And I think one of the biggest frustrations there was our apparent inability to match supply and demand. And that's what these digital platforms should really allow you to do. And at a government level, it was really challenging to figure out, well, where can we get stuff made? And everybody, within the industry knew we had these EMS companies with this outrageous capacity and ability and actually working practices that mean they're constantly changing products from day to day. So I think that's I think that's very, very important. One of the things that's coming up that's really important, Dave, is this reduced resilience on single suppliers, and even more so in terms of people's sentiment at the moment is on specific regions. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that this concept that I'll share is this idea of geographic resilience has never been more paramount in the conversations of supply chain. And so if we move to a world where we see more nationalism happen, geographic resilience is still really important, even at the hyperlocal level. That if I'm in China, do I produce in Wuxi, or do I produce in Shenzhen, or do I produce in Wuhan? It's a large country. Or if we look in the United States, am I going to produce in Southern California or Detroit, or am I going to be able to do it in Atlanta? This type of geographic resilience at both the national level and a global scale, I think is so important. And what it does, and I'll actually use this opportunity to answer another question that came in, which is around how do I develop something on a digital platform when a supplier has restrictions like Wake Home, or whether it's government standards. Digital platforms allow you to better match supply and demand together. If you remember, going back to this idea of choice, generally what happens is that you only know one supplier, maybe two suppliers, and so you just constantly go to them. So I love using the example of a car. I came from automotive, but in a car, I'm making everything from diesel engines to infotainment setters and computers to, rubber tires. And so imagine that if I have to go to the same supplier to make consumer electronics, rubber tires, and high pressurized like diesel engines, that's not going to work well. You're going to want to have multiple suppliers for where you make all of these things. So if you take the example of Fictiv, we can help you connect with ISO 13485, which is a medical device manufacturer. We can help you connect with an AS 9100, that's for aerospace. Almost all of them are 9001, which is a quality certification. So this just gives you more choice to say across your reliability, your cost structure, your lead time, where do you want to be able to produce your goods? And I think this choice is so critical so that you have a single supplier or a single platform that allows you to really be able to rely on multiple regions. And it's really around not single sourcing that I think is so critical.
Yeah, and by the way, I want to touch on a couple of more questions that came in. Some of them are really good. One of them was
go ahead, Misha.
Confidentiality and security in the digital process. So Dave comes out of the automotive world. I happen to come from the cybersecurity and privacy world. I actually think digital platforms enable us to have a lot more confidentiality and security than what's typically done right now. And I'm not going to comment on whether the Bloomberg story about the fact that Supermicro had their, and by extension, a whole lot of tech companies got their designs compromised at a factory level is true or false. To be honest, we just don't know. What I will tell you is that the level of traceability we have in digital platforms versus traditional supply chain platforms is night and day. And it's not about asking somebody to sign a piece of paper that says that it's going to be confidential. It's about verifying it and making sure that you build for that level of security. And it's just basic access controls, right? You shouldn't have to have packages. We're talking about gigs worth of data that I see people emailing around and sharing on Google Drive. That is probably the worst way to assure security and confidentiality. Digital platforms allow you to control just the right access to just the right people. So in my mind, we should be rushing towards digitization as opposed to away from it for security reasons. Same, with ability to be able to place jobs in regions where we have more certainty about legal frameworks, right?
Yeah.
There are places around the world where you can't take somebody to court, and the only recourse is WTO. And if you really have high security requirements and you need a legal framework behind you, then perhaps USMCA or NAFTA framework is the right place for you to go. This will get down to another question that was asked. It was about whether we're going to see nationalism push more production to be more domestic. Look at the opposite extremes of these questions. maybe the world becomes more nationalized, or maybe we all move to one intergalactic government. I don't know, and frankly, it's not my job to predict what's going to happen in the future. What our job, I think, is to make sure that whatever the future is, you have ultimate optionality to function in it. And I think we should abstract ourselves from any one of those answers. The real answer is, can you move to a different region, mode of operation? Can you move between factories as the world is reconfiguring itself? If the answer is no, then you're not ready. And I think digital platforms enable you to be much more mobile. And I'm not going to make predictions about what the world's going to look like. I have no idea.
Yeah. So I think we're going to both put you forward for seats in that intergalactic government. I think that's going to be interesting. Dave, can you speak a little bit to the way security is dealt with, but also a little bit to the way quality issues are dealt with when you shift to these digital platforms?
Yeah, I think that, whenever we talk about this idea of digital or distributed systems, quality always comes up. That people say, hey, how are you able to manage the production across all these facilities and ensure that you get a good product every single time? And I always love to take that question, turn it back on its head and say, well, how do you manage quality today? And most people, they say, well, we have supply quality engineers, we send them to the site and then they go and check it. I'm like, okay, so how often do you go there? And they're like, well, we do our QBRs, our quarterly business reviews. So let's say, okay, so your quality standards are, you write a document, you have a QMS system, and then once a quarter, so 4 times a year, you check the quality on your product. With a digital system, as you upload the files, you're getting instant pricing, designed for manufacturing feedback, and then it's going through and shipping. We're going to do more quality checks in an hour than you might do in an entire year. And this is really because of a digital thread that we create from end to end. And so from a security standpoint, what Misha's talking about, we know who's viewed the file, who's downloaded the file, when they checked it out, when they uploaded revs of the document. And that log is all the way through from upload to the part being signed by FedEx, like at your facility. And that's logged. And so in the same way from a quality, I know your digital asset gets uploaded. We can say this fillet or this chamfer isn't producible. And then you're like, okay, I make a rev, I change it, and then I have this new rev file, okay, adjust. And then you can monitor that feature all the way through to literally the FAI, the first article inspection document that's delivered. And so we believe that this type of digital thread is what drives up quality better than traditional suppliers. And it's really around having better checks and balances as a result. And I think this goes all the way through to rev control, to design control, all the way through to quality checks. That when we talk about quality, there's 2 stages. We say quality assurance and quality control. So assurance is what you do preemptive. This is all your checks and balances. And control is what you do reactive. How do you ensure that it's balanced? And you need to ensure that you're managing quality across this entire spectrum of QA and QC.
Yeah, and I guess, Misha, when you look at it from a group of manufacturing partners that you have, actually being able to manage quality for multiple customers in each of those makes that task more streamlined, not less so.
It is, and because we deal with final assembly, because we build electronics, and that, the range is anywhere between PCB assemblies that are sub-assemblies for others to go finish that final product, all the way to finished goods. In fact, Macrofab will actually ship product to the end user in some cases. Because of that, we have customers that say, look, I need to be able to go visit my factory. And sometimes that's okay, right? For really large contracts, when we get into hundreds of thousands of units or millions of dollars, there's some supply chain teams, they don't have a choice. They have to go visit their factory, and we let them do that. But I saw the exact same thing happen. And by the way, our system works exactly the same way as Fictiv. We have all the traceability and all of the visibility into what's going on. So ultimately, the real value is that you can see what's happening in Mexico or US down to the assembly station. And if you need to collect that data, that's something that's available to you. We can build a system that lets you do that. But ultimately, when I saw AWS go through this journey, there was about a 3 to 4 year period where customers still demanded to go visit the data centers, and Amazon let them, and now nobody even asks anymore, right? Because all of the tooling you have in a digital world is so much better. People have realized, look, the reason I go on a factory floor is because, you know, my process isn't as documented as well as it should be. And my test instructions are 5 years old, and I have to go tell the test engineer, here's how it actually works. And if I don't look the production manager in the eye and tell him, oh, I know this is why production is complicated. Here's all the little gotchas you got to be aware of to produce my product that's special. Look, all of those things turn products into snowflakes. And you know, snowflakes are special, and you know they melt very quickly, right? So look,
Yeah.
if that's the way it works, it's tribal knowledge and you know,
Yeah.
a lot of cutting corners that's enabling your production right now. To me, look, if you need to go to a factory, we're going to help you go to the factory. But ultimately, that means that we haven't digitized everything yet. And ultimately, if we're doing our jobs right, you don't need to be there, right? And that's a journey. That's not a switch you flip. The more you rely on digital technology, the less you have to get on a plane and go visit somebody, right?
Yeah, and I think that data trail's absolutely essential, and it's not just about quality and all those things. It's about having that traceability if you do have a recall or if you do have something that happens further down the line. One thing I'm learning very quickly is I should have booked 90 minutes, not an hour for this session. So we're already into the last 10 minutes, and I want to make sure we get through as many questions as possible. What I wanted to ask was, how quickly are people able to adapt? How quickly are supply chains able? How quickly will supply chains evolve? How quickly can they evolve? Clearly they need to. And I'm curious whether you both think this recent process is going to be an accelerator in that. Dave, take a swing at that.
I think we'll see more innovation in supply chain in the next, say, couple of years than we would in an entire decade because of the stress that's been put on the system. I think what's important to remember is supply chains are complex. This isn't something that's just going to change overnight, but I think it starts with teaching people to how to build economic arguments, to how to talk around why digitization is so important within their organizations. And that's step one. I think that we have the ability for supply chains to change overnight. I don't think it is a capability problem, but it is human behavior that we have to start to change folks to think that I don't just go to Bob's, you know, machine shop down the street. I need to think about a robust system. And so many times products are built in a needs-based environment. So it's that I'm just trying to get the thing to market. And so all I do is I just try to get it there versus how am I building in resiliency, or how do I think about building something that's truly lasts for a long time. So, you know, I do think supply chains can evolve very quickly, but it takes an investment both in terms of technology and innovation, but as well as human behavior.
Yeah, it's a mind shift. Misha, are you seeing more inbound inquiries that are making you think this process will accelerate?
We're seeing fewer people say, you know, I'm not sure if the way I'm doing this now is necessarily broken. I used to get that answer before, and I don't get that anymore. So I think in that sense, it's very much in an inflection point, and I think that's the reason why Dave is saying that we're going to innovate a lot more going forward. By the way, I completely agree that it's really a human behavior issue more than anything else. We already have a very distributed supply chain system. We just can't tap into it because we haven't digitized all of the supply chains yet. So the technologies there, maybe it's not what it can be over the next 10 years, but there is a lot of opportunity out there to digitize your supply chain. Now, do the largest enterprises out there want to do it? I think they do now, right? But I think, the reason why we haven't been able to do it before is not because the technology didn't exist. We didn't know how to do it. There is supply side of it all distributed all over the world. If we could just move it quickly enough, right, and make it truly agile, I think the supply chain wouldn't be as brittle, right? It's a paradox. It's both a commodity, but also it's very, very precious because we can't touch it and can't change it, right? So we got to start thinking about it as something that looks more like cattle than pets, right? We got to look at manufacturing as something that
Yeah.
we can just switch in a dime and move from one place to another, not get emotionally attached to it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I love the cattle to pets or cattle from pets idea. One of the things that's come up recently is the role of government in this whole thing, and we're seeing incentives in Japan, for example, to move supply chains out of China. We've seen bills in the US. Is there a role for government here, or should they be leaving supply chain to people that know about supply chain? What do you think, Dave?
I think government always plays a role. It's public-private sector. Trying to build supply chain without thinking how government will affect it positively or negatively is naive. So I think it's more around how do you build something that coexists together, and that I think I always love looking at history here, where you shouldn't say what is the current administration doing necessarily, but more the concept of, as policies change, how am I going to be able to react to this? So I really encourage folks, don't try to manage towards the flavor of the day. Think about how over the course of a decade or 5 years, how are you going to have resilience against government's influence, positive or negative, to your supply chain? And do you have plans to build against that? Because I think that we will continue to see, even pre-pandemic, we'll continue to see trade as a major lever between nations. As our globe gets smaller, I think we'll see more of the tariff, China-US in the next decade than less, is my prediction.
Yeah. Misha?
Look, let's be really clear about this. With a lot of times this being put into a context of, we're moving from a globalized free trade world to a balkanized nationalistic world. I don't think any of that is actually that black and white. We've never had a true free trade system, right? Trade is a Byzantine system of a lot of really complex agreements. And like Dave said, governments always played a role here. We just didn't always understand it and didn't always get into the details. And all of a sudden it's affecting daily life. And now we're wondering, why can't we have masks quickly, right? So look, it's been there the entire time. What I hope we see is that, so absolutely, government has a role and has to take an active role. There is no scenario where you just sit back and let free market take over, because it's never worked that way and it's not going to work that way. But it also, I hope it's not angry either, right? None of this should come from perspective of anger. We should just be rational about this and just ask reasonable questions. Do we really want to have all of our production done outside of our shores? Does that even make sense? And if it doesn't, let's just build it right.
Yeah. So guys, we are running out of time. We're actually in the last minute already. We have got a huge number of questions which would allow us to go for another 20 minutes. I'm going to make sure those questions are circulated to the panel and we get to answer those by email. So rest assured, everybody's questions will be answered. I just really want to go through with the two of you and get what you think are the key takeaways, what the key pieces of advice and information you'd give to those watching to take away from today's session. Dave, perhaps I can start with you on that one.
Yeah, for sure. I think that what I would push for folks to think about is that number two. It's the choice and flexibility. How can digitization help your organization create more choice for where and how your products are built, and more flexibility in the environment for how it's created? And the result of that is true agility in your supply chain. We get a lot of questions around, how do I build this argument within our organization? How can I be a change agent? And so if you have questions like that, please feel free to reach out to myself or my team, and happy to help talk through some of the nuances for how you build the strategy inside of your org. And Phil, thanks for hosting this, and Misha, it's always awesome to spend time together. So
likewise.
Yeah.
I think you guys could cheerfully talk all day. Misha, what are your key take homes?
Just one bit of advice. Start early and make sure that your products are digitized and can be put into factories or machine shops through digital platforms early on. Because if you're not, you're just building technical debt into what's going to have to happen in the future. Again, I just keep thinking back to what Ford and GM had to go do to build ventilators. And just the very notion of having to sit there and 3D scan parts to me sounds crazy. And yet that is exactly how most people would do it today if they had to do it from scratch. Dave, you know this better than I would, right? If all of those parts were in your platform, they wouldn't need to 3D scan anything, right? You would just choose.
You just click a button, you'd be like, reorder, and it'd be done.
Yeah.
Look, to me, all of that looks like technical debt, right? If you're shipping PDFs, and if you're, if the way that you interact with when your manufacturers right now is email and phone calls, chances are the future is going to be hard to attain, right? So start early on and start with most products. It's going to take a while to digitize all this, but when you do, I think the benefits are going to be tremendous, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, don't be that guy digitizing those parts, scanning those parts on the day that production needs to be shifted.
That's the reason why things got so heated, right? I mean, I felt bad for those companies because it's expensive. You can't do it quickly enough, and yet they're sitting there struggling with it, right? It shouldn't work that way, right?
Yeah. So guys, thank you so much for your time. Fantastic insight. I think there's a huge amount there for people to take away. And as I say, lots of audience interaction. We've clearly got people in the audience that are using both of your platforms to build their product portfolio, which is really fascinating. Thanks very much for all of your time and insight. Thanks for everybody that's taken part. That's all we've got time for today. Would have loved to have more time, and I'm sure we'll talk again in the future, but thank you very, very much.
Right on. Be safe, be well, everyone. Thanks.